At a family dinner, I dropped my fork. The sound of sterling silver hitting hardwood echoed through my sister's dining room like a gunshot in a cathedral. When I bent down to retrieve it, I saw my brother-in-law Jonathan's leg pressed intimately between my fiancée Sloane's under the mahogany table. Time stopped. The grandfather clock in the corner ceased its ticking. The gentle murmur of conversation above me faded to nothing. There, in the shadows beneath expensive linen, two sets of legs intertwined in a way that spoke of practiced intimacy and shared secrets. I stayed crouched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. My mind processed the scene with the methodical precision of an accountant reviewing fraudulent books. Jonathan's Italian leather shoe rested against Sloane's bare ankle. Her foot, the one I'd massaged countless evenings while we watched television, caressed his calf through expensive wool trousers. When I finally straightened up, fork in hand, they both froze like deer caught in headlights. The color drained from Sloane's face, leaving her foundation looking chalky against her suddenly pale skin. Jonathan's confident smile faltered, replaced by the expression of a man calculating escape routes. My sister Beatrice continued her animated story about the country club's new tennis pro, oblivious to the silent drama unfolding at her dinner table. My father Richard nodded politely, occasionally glancing at his watch with the practiced patience of a man who'd endured decades of family gatherings. "Everything all right, Edward?" Beatrice asked, finally noticing my prolonged absence from the conversation. "Perfect," I replied, setting the fork beside my untouched salmon. "Just perfect." Jonathan cleared his throat, the sound rough and nervous. He looked directly at me, and I saw the exact moment he decided to take control of the situation. His shoulders squared, his jaw set, and he adopted the commanding tone he used in his law practice. "Edward," he said, rising from his chair with deliberate calm, "let's step out for a few words." The dining room fell silent. Beatrice's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Father's wineglass stopped mid-sip. Even the candles seemed to flicker less enthusiastically. I followed Jonathan through the French doors onto the stone patio, leaving behind the warmth of the dining room for the crisp October evening. The scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke filled my nostrils as I prepared for whatever rehearsed explanation he'd put together. "Look, Edward," Jonathan began, his voice taking on the reasonable tone he used with difficult clients. "I know what you think you saw down there, but I know exactly what I saw," I interrupted, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "The question is, how long has this been going on?" He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, disturbing not a single strand. "It's complicated. Sloane and I, we never meant for this to happen. It just... How long, Jonathan?" His pause told me everything. Not weeks, not months. This had roots, history, comfortable familiarity. 6 months, he finally admitted. Maybe 7. 7 months. While I'd been planning our wedding, choosing flowers, and tasting cakes, my fiancée had been conducting an affair with my brother-in-law. While I'd been working overtime at the accounting firm to pay for the reception venue she'd insisted upon, she'd been finding creative ways to spend time with Jonathan. "Does Beatrice know?" I asked. "Of course not. Edward, listen to me. This doesn't have to destroy everything. We can work this out like adults. Sloane loves you. She really does. This thing between us, it's just physical. It doesn't mean anything." I almost laughed at the absurdity. Jonathan Holt, successful attorney and pillar of the community, standing on his own patio trying to convince me that his affair with my fiancée was somehow a minor inconvenience we could negotiate around. "You're right," I said finally. "This doesn't have to destroy everything." Relief flooded his features. "Exactly. We're all reasonable people here. We can... It already has." I turned and walked back into the dining room, leaving Jonathan on the patio with his mouth hanging open. The 3 remaining family members looked up expectantly as I returned alone. "Where's Jonathan?" Beatrice asked. "Getting some air," I replied, taking my seat. He needed a moment to collect himself. I picked up my water glass and took a sip, savoring the cool liquid and the anticipation of what came next. Sloane's eyes were wide with panic, silently pleading with me to maintain the charade. "I have an announcement," I said, setting down the glass with deliberate precision. "Sloane and I won't be getting married after all. It seems she's been practicing her wedding night activities with Jonathan for the past 7 months. The silence that followed was deafening. Beatrice's wineglass slipped from her fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor in an explosion of crystal and Cabernet. The red wine spread across the white oak like spilled paint, seeping into the grain where it would leave permanent stains. "That's not true," Sloane whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. "Edward, you're being ridiculous. I would never—" "Under the table," I continued conversationally, as if discussing the weather. "Right now, while we were all sharing a family meal, Their legs were intertwined like lovers, which I suppose they are. Father set down his fork with the measured control of a man processing shocking information. His face remained neutral, but I caught the slight tightening around his eyes that indicated his analytical mind working through implications. Beatrice found her voice first. "Jonathan," she called, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. "Get in here, now." Jonathan appeared in the doorway, his face flushed from the cold air and, I suspected, panic. "What's wrong?" "Sit down," Beatrice commanded, pointing to his chair. "Edward has something to share with us." "I've already shared it," I said. "The question now is what everyone plans to do about it." Sloane pushed back from the table, her chair scraping against the floor. "I don't have to listen to this. Edward, you're being paranoid and cruel. I'm going home." "Our home," I corrected. "The one I've been paying for while you've been entertaining Jonathan. But you're right, you should go. Pack your things while you're there." She stood, her hands shaking as she reached for her purse. "This is insane. You're destroying everything over a misunderstanding." "The only thing I'm destroying is the illusion that I was marrying a faithful woman." Jonathan finally found his voice. "Edward, please. Let's discuss this privately. There's no need to involve the whole family." "The whole family was already involved," I replied. "They just didn't know it yet." Beatrice looked between her husband and my fiancé, her sharp legal mind assembling the pieces. "How long?" she asked quietly. Neither Jonathan nor Sloane answered. 7 months, I supplied helpfully, according to Jonathan, though I suspect it's been longer. The color drained from Beatrice's face as she processed the timeline. 7 months ago, she and Jonathan had hosted a dinner party to celebrate my engagement to Sloane. 7 months ago, while I'd been accepting congratulations and planning a future, my fiancé and brother-in-law had apparently been planning something entirely different. "Get out," Beatrice said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Both of you, get out of my house." Sloane grabbed her coat from the closet, her movements sharp and angry. "Fine. Edward, when you come to your senses, you know where to find me." "Actually, I don't," I replied, "since you won't be living in my house anymore." She slammed the front door hard enough to rattle the windows. Jonathan lingered, looking between his wife and me as if searching for some way to salvage the situation. "Beatrice, honey, we need to talk about this. It's not what you think." "It's exactly what I think," she interrupted. "And if you're not out of this house in the next 5 minutes, I'm calling the police." Jonathan's shoulders sagged in defeat. He grabbed his jacket and followed Sloane into the night, leaving behind the wreckage of 2 relationships and 1 very expensive dinner. Father and I sat in silence for several minutes, listening to Beatrice move around the kitchen, the sounds of dishes being scraped and water running providing a mundane soundtrack to the evening's drama. "Well," Father said finally, "that was certainly more eventful than our usual family dinners." Despite everything, I found myself smiling. The fork cost $3 at the antique shop, considerably less than a wedding would have. "Indeed," he agreed, raising his wine glass in a mock toast, "to small mercies and well-timed accidents." As I drove home that night, I felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. The weight of planning a wedding, of pretending everything was perfect, of ignoring the small inconsistencies in Sloane's behavior that I'd attributed to pre-wedding stress, lifted from my shoulders. My phone buzzed with text messages, Sloane alternating between apologies and accusations, Jonathan trying to explain, Beatrice asking if I was all right. I ignored them all. The house felt different when I walked in. Emptier somehow, though Sloane hadn't taken anything yet. Her presence lingered in the carefully arranged throw pillows, the scented candles, the framed photos of us at various events where we'd played the part of the happy couple. I poured myself a glass of whiskey and sat in my leather chair, the one Sloane had always complained was too masculine for the living room. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. My phone rang. Sloane's name appeared on the screen, but I let it go to voicemail. Then Jonathan called, then Sloane again. I turned off the phone and finished my drink in blessed silence. Tomorrow, I would deal with the practical matters. The wedding venue would need to be canceled, deposits forfeited, guests notified. Our joint bank account would need to be closed, bills redirected, her name removed from the lease. The life we'd built together would need to be systematically dismantled. But tonight, I was content to sit in my too masculine chair, drinking good whiskey and marveling at how one dropped fork had saved me from making the biggest mistake of my life. The next morning arrived with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. I woke to find 17 missed calls, 32 text messages, and one very angry woman standing in my kitchen making coffee as if nothing had happened. "We need to talk," Sloane announced without looking up from the machine. I stood in the doorway, taking in the scene. She'd let herself in with the key I'd forgotten to reclaim, dressed in the navy suit she wore to important meetings, her makeup applied with military precision. Everything about her screamed control and determination. "Actually, we don't," I replied, walking past her to grab a mug from the cabinet. "You made your position quite clear last night, and for the past 7 months, apparently." "Edward, please, you're being childish about this whole situation." The audacity was breathtaking. I turned to face her, coffee pot in hand, and studied her face for any sign of genuine remorse. Her expression remained fixed in that practiced look of patient reasoning she used when explaining complex procedures to difficult clients at her marketing firm. "Childish," I repeated slowly. Interesting choice of words from someone who's been playing house with her fiancé's brother-in-law. "It's not like that," she insisted, finally meeting my eyes. "Jonathan and I, we have a connection. It's complicated, but it doesn't change how I feel about you." "You're right. It doesn't change how you feel about me. It reveals how you feel about me." She set down her mug with enough force to slosh coffee onto the granite countertop. "Fine. You want the truth? Jonathan understands me in ways you never have. He's sophisticated, cultured, successful. He doesn't spend his evenings buried in spreadsheets or obsessing over retirement accounts." There it was. The truth beneath the careful apologies and manufactured explanations, not a moment of weakness or a mistake she regretted, but a calculated choice based on what she perceived as my inadequacies. "I see," I said calmly. "And yet you were perfectly willing to marry me and my unsophisticated spreadsheets." "Because I love you," she said, but the words sounded hollow. "I do, Edward, just not in the way you need me to." "Then we agree on something. You should pack your things." Her composure finally cracked. "Just like that? 5 years together, and you're throwing it all away over one mistake?" 7 months isn't one mistake, Sloan. It's a deliberate pattern of betrayal and deception. My phone rang, interrupting what was shaping up to be an unproductive argument. Beatrice's name appeared on the screen. "Edward?" Her voice sounded strained, exhausted. "I'm sorry to bother you so early, but I wanted to check on you and to let you know that Jonathan spent the night at his office. I changed the locks." "Are you all right?" I asked, aware that Sloan was listening to every word. "I will be. I've already called my attorney. Edward, I'm so sorry. I had no idea this was happening under my own roof." "None of us did," I replied. That was rather the point. After I hung up, Sloan stared at me with something approaching panic. "Beatrice kicked Jonathan out?" "Apparently so. Seems she's less understanding about adultery than you expected me to be." "This is getting out of hand. Edward, we can fix this, all of us. We just need to sit down like adults and work through the issues." I almost admired her persistence. Even faced with the complete collapse of her carefully constructed arrangement, she was still trying to negotiate a solution that would allow her to keep both men in her life. "The only issue here is that you and Jonathan destroyed 2 relationships for the sake of whatever this is between you. There's nothing to work through." She stood, smoothing down her skirt with practiced efficiency. "Fine, I'll pack my things this afternoon. But Edward, when you realize what you're giving up, don't expect me to come running back." "I wouldn't dream of it." After she left, I called in sick to work and spent the morning researching wedding cancellation policies. The venue would keep half the deposit. The caterer required 2 weeks' notice for a full refund, which we'd missed by 3 days. The photographer was surprisingly understanding, offering to reschedule for a future event at no additional charge. The florist, however, was less accommodating. "Mr. Waverly, the flowers have already been ordered," she explained with barely concealed irritation. "White roses don't grow themselves, you know. We've committed significant resources to your event." "I understand, but the wedding isn't happening. Surely you can resell the flowers to another client." "It's not that simple. These were custom arrangements based on your fiancé's very specific requirements. She insisted on a particular shade of white that required special ordering from our supplier in Oregon." Of course she had. Sloane's attention to detail, which I'd once found endearing, now felt like another burden to bear. Even her perfectionism was going to cost me money. By noon, I'd tallied the financial damage. $4,000 in non-refundable deposits, another $2,000 in cancellation fees, and the psychological cost of explaining to 150 wedding guests why their presence was no longer required. The guest notification proved to be the most challenging aspect. How do you explain the sudden cancellation of a wedding without sounding bitter or vindictive? I settled on a simple message. "Due to unforeseen circumstances, the wedding of Edward Waverly and Sloan Mercer has been canceled. We apologize for any inconvenience." My phone began ringing immediately, our friends and family members wanting details, offering support, expressing shock and concern. I answered the first few calls with patient explanations, but by the 5th conversation, I was letting everything go to voicemail. Around 3 o'clock, Sloane returned with 2 large suitcases and a grim expression. She moved through the house methodically, collecting her belongings with the efficiency of someone who'd been planning this evacuation for some time. "The Waterford crystal was a gift from my grandmother," she said, wrapping stemware in tissue paper. "I'm taking it." "Fine." "And the painting in the bedroom. I bought that before we moved in together." "Take it." Her systematic claiming of possessions continued for an hour. The coffee table books, the decorative pillows, the expensive kitchen gadgets she'd insisted we needed but rarely used. Each item she packed felt like another small liberation. "What about the engagement ring?" she asked finally. I looked at her left hand, noting that she was still wearing the 2-carat solitaire I'd spent 3 months' salary on. "What about it? Do you want it back?" The question hung in the air between us. The ring represented everything we'd planned together, all the promises we'd made, the future we'd envisioned. It also represented the biggest single purchase I'd ever made, money that could now go toward rebuilding my life instead of commemorating a lie. "Keep it," I said. "Consider it payment for 7 months of entertainment." She flinched at that, the first genuine emotional response I'd seen from her all day. "That's cruel, Edward." "No, Sloane. Cruel would be letting you marry me while you were in love with someone else." She finished packing in silence, loading her car with the accumulated artifacts of our relationship. As she prepared to leave, she paused in the doorway. "For what it's worth, I really did love you. I still do, in my way." "I know," I replied. "That's what makes this so tragic." After she left, I walked through the house, cataloging the empty spaces where her possessions had been. The walls looked bare without her artwork, the shelves sparse without her books. But the house felt more like mine than it had in years. I opened a bottle of wine, something expensive that Sloane had been saving for a special occasion, and sat on the porch watching the sun set over the neighborhood where we'd planned to raise children together. My phone buzzed with a text from Father. "Dinner tomorrow? I'm buying." I smiled and typed back, "Absolutely." The worst part was over. The shock, the confrontation, the immediate aftermath of discovery. What remained was the slower work of rebuilding, of figuring out who I was without Sloane, of creating a new normal from the wreckage of the old. But sitting there on my porch, drinking wine that tasted like freedom, I felt something I hadn't expected. Anticipation. For the first time in months, maybe years, the future felt wide open and full of possibilities. 3 weeks later, I was beginning to appreciate the simple pleasure of eating dinner without wondering who my companion was texting. I'd established new routines, morning runs instead of shared breakfasts, evening reading instead of mindless television, weekend projects instead of social obligations that felt more like performance art. The doorbell rang on a Tuesday evening while I was reviewing quarterly reports for a client. Through the peephole, I saw Jonathan standing on my porch, looking considerably less polished than usual. His typically perfect hair was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled, and he carried himself with the defeated posture of a man whose carefully constructed world had collapsed. I opened the door but didn't invite him in. "Edward," he began, his voice hoarse, "we need to talk." "No, we don't. Please, 5 minutes. I need to explain some things." Against my better judgment, I stepped aside and let him enter. He looked around the living room, noting the changes I'd made since Sloane's departure. The furniture rearranged, new artwork on the walls, the overall atmosphere lighter and more masculine. "You've redecorated," he observed. "I've reclaimed my space. What do you want, Jonathan?" He sat heavily in the chair Sloane used to occupy, a piece of irony that wasn't lost on either of us. "Beatrice filed for divorce yesterday. She's asking for everything, the house, the cars, half my practice, full custody of the kids when they visit from college." "I'm sorry to hear that," I lied. "Are you? Because I think you're enjoying this. Watching everything fall apart, seeing me lose everything I've worked for." I studied his face, searching for any sign of genuine remorse or accountability. Instead, I saw self-pity and resentment, the expression of a man who viewed himself as the victim of circumstances rather than the architect of his own destruction. "You lost everything the moment you decided to pursue my fiancée," I replied. "The divorce papers are just paperwork." "It wasn't supposed to happen this way. Sloane and I, we tried to stop it. We knew it was wrong, but the connection between us was too strong." "How romantic, and how convenient that this irresistible connection coincided with your midlife crisis and her cold feet about marriage." He leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together. "You don't understand what it's like, Edward. Being married to someone for 15 years, falling into routines, losing that spark. Beatrice and I, we became roommates who happened to share a bed. So you decided to share someone else's bed instead. It wasn't like that. Sloane understands me. She sees who I really am. Not just the successful attorney or the reliable husband or the responsible father. With her, I feel alive again. The self-serving nature of his explanation was breathtaking. In Jonathan's version of events, he was the romantic hero following his heart, not a middle-aged man who'd blown up 2 families for the sake of an affair. "Where is Sloane now?" I asked. "She's staying at a hotel downtown, the Marriott on 5th Street. She's been there since she left here." "And you're not with her because?" His silence stretched long enough to answer the question. Whatever grand passion had driven their affair, it apparently wasn't strong enough to survive the harsh light of public scrutiny and real-world consequences. "It's complicated," he said finally. "No, Jonathan, it's simple. You wanted the excitement of an affair without the responsibility of a relationship. Now that both are available to you, you're discovering that stolen moments in hotel rooms don't translate to sustainable partnerships." "That's not fair." "Fair?" I stood up, my patience finally exhausted. "You want to discuss fairness. Let's talk about fairness to Beatrice, who supported your career while you were building your practice. Fairness to your children, who now get to explain to their friends why their parents are getting divorced. Fairness to me, who spent 5 years building a life with someone who was apparently just marking time until something better came along. Edward, I'm trying to make this right. There is no making this right. There's only living with the consequences of your choices." He stood to leave, but paused at the door. For what it's worth, I never meant for anyone to get hurt. Everyone always gets hurt, Jonathan. That's what makes it betrayal instead of just poor judgment. After he left, I poured myself a drink and considered the conversation. Jonathan's visit had been less about apology than about seeking absolution, looking for someone to tell him that his actions were understandable, forgivable, perhaps even noble in their own misguided way. I couldn't give him that comfort. More importantly, I didn't want to. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Beatrice stood at my door holding a covered dish and wearing the strained smile of someone trying to maintain normalcy in abnormal circumstances. "I brought lasagna," she announced. "I made too much, and I thought you might be tired of bachelor cooking." I invited her in, noting how different she looked without the polished perfection she usually maintained. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore jeans instead of designer clothes, and her face showed the strain of the past few weeks. "How are you holding up?" I asked as she set the dish on my counter. "Some days better than others. The divorce attorney says it could take months to sort everything out. Jonathan's being difficult about the asset division." "I'm sorry you're going through this." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Are you? Because part of me wonders if you're not a little satisfied to see us both paying for what we did to you." The question was fair, and it deserved an honest answer. I'm satisfied that actions have consequences. I'm sorry that you're paying for choices you didn't make. But I did make choices, Edward. I chose to ignore the signs, to explain away the late nights and the secretive phone calls. I chose to believe Jonathan when he said he was working late or meeting clients. I enabled this by being willfully blind. We sat in my kitchen, eating her lasagna and talking about the practical aspects of dismantling a marriage. The division of property, the custody arrangements for college-age children, the social awkwardness of mutual friends choosing sides. "The hardest part," she said, "is realizing how long I've been living a lie. Not just since the affair started, but for years before that. Our marriage was already over, I just didn't want to admit it." "Do you regret finding out?" "No. I regret wasting so much time pretending everything was fine when it clearly wasn't." After she left, I reflected on the parallel paths our lives had taken. Both of us had been living in relationships that were more performance than partnership, maintaining the appearance of happiness while ignoring the growing distance between ourselves and our partners. The difference was that Beatrice had been genuinely committed to making her marriage work, while Sloane had been actively undermining ours. Beatrice deserved sympathy. Sloane deserved exactly what she'd gotten. That evening, I decided to drive past the Marriott on 5th Street. I told myself it was curiosity, not surveillance, but I knew better. I wanted to see how Sloane was living, whether she looked happy or regretful, whether Jonathan was with her, or if she was facing the consequences of her choices alone. I found her in the hotel bar, sitting by herself at a corner table, nursing what looked like her second or third drink. She wore the black dress I'd always liked, the one that made her look elegant and sophisticated. Her hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, but something in her posture suggested defeat. She saw me before I could decide whether to approach or leave. Our eyes met across the dimly lit room, and she raised her glass in a mock toast before downing the remainder of her drink. I walked over to her table, driven by a curiosity I couldn't quite explain. "Edward," she said, her voice slightly slurred, "come to gloat?" "Just passing by. Saw you through the window." Sure you were. Sit down, buy me a drink. Let's talk about old times. Against my better judgment, I sat. She signaled the waitress for another round, and we sat in awkward silence until the drinks arrived. So, she said finally, how's the bachelor life treating you? Well enough. How's the hotel life treating you? Like exactly what it is? Expensive and temporary? She took a sip of her fresh drink. Jonathan's been here twice since I moved in, both times to explain why he can't be here more often. I'm sorry to hear that. No, you're not. You're thinking that I got exactly what I deserved. She was right, but I didn't say so. Instead, I asked, what's your plan now? Find a new apartment, I suppose. Start over. Figure out who I am when I'm not half of a couple. That's not such a bad thing. Easy for you to say. You chose to be alone. I'm alone because the man I left you for decided I wasn't worth the trouble after all. The bitterness in her voice was unmistakable, and for a moment, I felt something approaching sympathy. Then I remembered the 7 months of lies, the careful deception, the casual way she dismissed our relationship as insufficient. You made your choice, Sloane. Jonathan made his. Now you both get to live with the consequences. God, you're self-righteous. Do you know that? Always so calm, so reasonable, so morally superior. I'm not superior. I'm just not interested in pretending that what you did was acceptable. She finished her drink and stood to leave. Well, congratulations, Edward. You won. I hope it feels as good as you thought it would. I watched her walk away, noting the slight unsteadiness in her step, the careful way she held herself upright. She was right about one thing. I had won. But victory felt less satisfying than I'd expected. The truth was, I didn't want revenge anymore. I wanted peace, closure, the simple satisfaction of a life lived honestly. Sloane and Jonathan would have to find their own way through the wreckage they'd created. I had more important things to do than watch them struggle with consequences they'd brought upon themselves. 6 months after the dinner that changed everything, I was learning to appreciate the unexpected benefits of starting over at 35. The house felt like home again. My routines were my own, and I'd discovered that I actually enjoyed cooking for one person who appreciated the effort. I was preparing dinner on a Friday evening when the doorbell rang. Through the window, I saw a woman I didn't recognize. Mid-30s, auburn hair, wearing jeans and a Georgetown University sweatshirt, holding what appeared to be a bottle of wine. Mr. Waverly, she said when I opened the door. I'm Rachel Morrison. I just moved in next door, and I wanted to introduce myself. She had an easy smile and the kind of direct gaze that suggested confidence without arrogance. I invited her in, noting that she moved through my space with the casual comfort of someone accustomed to making herself at home anywhere. I brought wine, she said, holding up the bottle. A housewarming gift, though technically I suppose it should be a house-cooling gift since I'm the one who just moved in. Wine is always appropriate, I replied. Can I offer you dinner? I made enough pasta for 3 people, which seems to be my standard cooking error these days. I'd love that. Fair warning, though, I'm a food critic, so I might actually have opinions about your cooking. Over dinner, I learned that Rachel wrote restaurant reviews for the City magazine, had recently moved from Boston after a divorce, and possessed the rare ability to ask personal questions without making them feel intrusive. So, she said, twirling linguine around her fork with practiced efficiency, the neighbors filled me in on some of the local drama, something about a canceled wedding and musical chairs with relationships? The neighbors have excellent intelligence networks, I replied. What exactly did they tell you? The basics. Fiancé cheating with brother-in-law, dramatic revelation at family dinner, multiple divorces ensuing. They made it sound like a soap opera. It felt like one while it was happening. Are you better off now? The question was simple, but it required a more complex answer than I'd expected. Yes, but not for the reasons people might think. I'm not better off because I escaped a bad marriage or because the people who betrayed me are suffering consequences. I'm better off because I'm finally living honestly. That's a mature perspective. Most people in your situation would be focused on revenge or vindication. I considered both, but revenge requires you to stay emotionally invested in people who've already taken too much of your energy. I'd rather invest in building something new. We talked until nearly midnight, covering everything from food to books to travel to the peculiar challenges of starting over in your 30s. When she finally left, I realized I'd enjoyed myself more than I had in months. The next morning, I was working in my garden when Rachel appeared at the fence separating our yards. Coffee? She offered, holding up 2 steaming mugs. We sat on my back porch, watching the sunrise and discussing her plans for the neglected garden she'd inherited with her house. She had ambitious ideas involving raised beds, herb gardens, and a small greenhouse. I've never actually grown anything before, she admitted, but I figure if I'm going to write about food, I should understand where it comes from. I could help, I offered. I've been gardening for years. It's therapeutic. I'd like that. Fair warning, though, I'm probably going to ask a lot of stupid questions. There are no stupid questions in gardening, only expensive mistakes. Over the following weeks, we fell into a comfortable routine. Morning coffee on one of our porches, evening walks around the neighborhood, weekend projects in our respective gardens. Rachel proved to be an enthusiastic student, approaching gardening with the same methodical curiosity she brought to restaurant reviews. "This is nice," she said one evening as we sat watching the sunset from my porch swing. "Comfortable, easy." "Is that good or bad?" "Good. Definitely good. My marriage was never easy. Everything was complicated, dramatic, emotionally exhausting. I thought that meant it was passionate, but really it just meant it was unhealthy." I understood exactly what she meant. My relationship with Sloane had been built on constant negotiation, careful management of her moods and expectations, the exhausting work of maintaining harmony rather than enjoying genuine compatibility. "What happened with your marriage?" I asked. "He cheated. Multiple times with multiple people. I kept forgiving him because I thought that's what committed people do. Turns out there's a difference between commitment and enabling. I'm sorry. Don't be. Best thing that ever happened to me, even though it didn't feel that way at the time." We sat in comfortable silence, watching the fireflies begin their evening dance across the yard. The peace between us felt natural, unforced, like something that had been waiting patiently for us to discover it. "Edward," she said finally, "I should probably mention that I know more about your situation than I let on initially." I turned to look at her, noting the slight tension in her shoulders that suggested nervous honesty. "How much more?" "I know about the engagement ring that your ex-fiancé tried to sell to a jewelry store downtown. The owner is a friend of mine, and he mentioned the story when she couldn't provide proper documentation of ownership." "She tried to sell it?" "Apparently she needed money for a security deposit on an apartment. The jeweler wouldn't buy it without proof of ownership, so she left empty-handed and angry." The information shouldn't have surprised me, but it did. Sloane had kept the ring out of sentimentality, or so I'd assumed. Learning that she'd tried to convert it to cash felt like a final insult to the relationship we'd once shared. "I also know," Rachel continued, "that your brother-in-law's law practice is struggling financially. He's been trying to borrow money from several local banks, using his pending divorce settlement as collateral." "Where are you getting this information?" "Food critics hear a lot of gossip. We eat at the same restaurants as lawyers, bankers, real estate agents. People talk, especially when they have had a few drinks." I processed this new intelligence, trying to decide how I felt about Jonathan's financial troubles. Part of me was satisfied that his choices were continuing to generate consequences. Another part was simply tired of the whole situation. "Does it bother you that they're both struggling?" Rachel asked. "Less than I expected it would. More than I wish it did." "That's honest." "I'm trying to be more honest about everything these days." She reached over and took my hand, her fingers warm against mine. "Good. Honesty is underrated." That night, after Rachel went home, I sat in my kitchen thinking about the strange turns my life had taken. A year ago, I'd been planning a wedding to a woman who was systematically deceiving me. Tonight, I'd held hands with a neighbor who seemed to value the same things I did. Honesty, simplicity, the quiet satisfaction of building something real rather than maintaining something artificial. The contrast was striking, and it made me grateful for that dropped fork and everything that had followed. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you turns out to be the first step toward the best thing that could happen to you. I was beginning to understand that the opposite of betrayal isn't revenge, it's trust. And for the first time in longer than I cared to admit, I was ready to trust again. 1 year after the dinner that ended my engagement, I received an invitation that made me laugh out loud. Jonathan and Sloane were getting married. The invitation was elegant, expensive, and completely lacking in self-awareness. They'd chosen the same venue where Sloane and I were supposed to have been married, the same florist who'd lectured me about the cost of custom white roses, even the same photographer who'd offered to reschedule our canceled session. Rachel found me reading the invitation at my kitchen table, coffee growing cold as I marveled at the audacity. "Well," she said, looking over my shoulder, "that's certainly something." "It's something, all right. I'm just not sure what." "Are you going?" The question caught me off guard. I hadn't even considered attending, but now that she'd asked, I found myself actually thinking about it. "Would you come with me if I did?" "Absolutely. I wouldn't miss it." 2 weeks later, we stood in the back of the same church where I'd once planned to make vows to Sloane, watching her make those same vows to Jonathan. The ceremony was smaller than ours would have been. Apparently, their social circle had contracted significantly over the past year, Beatrice wasn't there, of course. She'd finalized her divorce 6 months earlier and moved to Seattle to be closer to her children. Father had declined his invitation with characteristic diplomacy, claiming a prior commitment that we both knew was fictional. The bride looked beautiful, as brides always do, but there was something brittle about her smile, something forced about her happiness. Jonathan appeared nervous, fidgeting with his tie and glancing frequently at the sparse congregation. "He looks like a man who's not entirely sure he's making the right choice," Rachel whispered. "She looks like a woman who's not entirely sure she has any other choices," I whispered back. During the reception, held in the hotel ballroom where Sloane was still living, we mingled with the other guests and collected fragments of gossip that painted a picture of two people who'd found themselves together more by default than by design. Jonathan's law practice was indeed struggling. The divorce had cost him more than half his assets, and several major clients had dropped him when news of the affair became public. Sloane's marketing firm had let her go during a restructuring that everyone understood was really about avoiding the drama she'd brought to the workplace. They'd found each other in their mutual isolation, two people whose choices had narrowed their options until they only had each other. "It's almost sad," Rachel observed as we watched them cut their wedding cake with smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. "Almost," I agreed. Sloane approached our table during the dinner service, moving with the careful grace of someone who'd had just enough champagne to feel brave, but not enough to forget her audience. "Edward," she said, her voice bright with artificial warmth, "I'm so glad you came, and you must be Rachel. I've heard so much about you." "Congratulations," I replied. "You look lovely." "Thank you. I wanted to tell you how happy I am that you found someone. You deserve to be happy." The conversation was surreal. Two people who'd once planned a life together now making polite small talk at her wedding to the man she'd left me for. But there was something else beneath the surface pleasantries, something that felt like genuine regret. "I also wanted to apologize," she continued, her voice dropping to a more private tone, "for how everything happened, for the lying, the deception, the way it all came out. You didn't deserve that." "No," I agreed, "I didn't. I hope you can forgive me. Someday." I looked at her standing there in her wedding dress, asking for absolution on what should have been the happiest day of her life, and I felt something unexpected. Pity. "I forgave you a long time ago, Sloane. Not for your sake, but for mine." She nodded, tears threatening her carefully applied makeup. "Thank you." After she moved on to other tables, Rachel squeezed my hand under the table. That was kind. It was honest. I really did forgive her. Holding on to anger would have poisoned everything good that came after. And there was a lot of good that came after. Yes, there was. We left the reception early, walking hand in hand through the downtown streets where I'd once imagined building a life with someone else. The night was warm, perfect for walking, and we took our time getting back to the car. "Do you think they'll make it?" Rachel asked. "I think they'll try. Whether they succeed depends on whether they can build something real together or if they're just two people who ran out of better options." That's a harsh assessment. It's a realistic one. Love born from desperation rarely survives prosperity. We drove home in comfortable silence, both lost in our own thoughts about the evening's strange theater. When we pulled into our driveways, Rachel turned to me with a mischievous smile. "You know what I realized tonight?" "What's that?" "I'm grateful to Sloane. If she hadn't cheated on you, you might have married her, and I never would have met you." That's a twisted way to look at it. The best things in life often come from twisted circumstances. Later that night, as I sat on my porch with a glass of wine, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me to this point. A year ago, I'd thought my life was ruined. Tonight, I understood that it had actually been saved. The dropped fork had been the beginning, not the end. Everything that followed, the confrontations, the revelations, the painful process of rebuilding, had led me to a place I never could have reached while living the lie I'd mistaken for love. Rachel appeared on her porch with her own glass of wine, settling into the chair that had become hers over the months we'd been neighbors and friends and something more. "Penny for your thoughts," she said. "I was thinking about forks." "Forks?" How such a small thing can change everything. If I hadn't dropped that fork, hadn't seen what I saw under that table, I might have married Sloane and spent years living a lie. Or you might have discovered the truth some other way at some other time. Maybe. But I like to think that fork was fate's way of saving me from making a terrible mistake. "Then here's to forks," she said, raising her glass, "and to the courage to see what they reveal." "To forks," I agreed, "and to new beginnings." We sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars appear one by one in the clear night sky. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and opportunities. But tonight was perfect exactly as it was. I'd learned that the opposite of betrayal isn't revenge, it's trust. The opposite of deception isn't anger, it's honesty. And the opposite of a broken heart isn't a hardened heart. It's a heart that's learned to love more wisely. The fork had cost $3 at an antique shop. It had saved me from a marriage that would have cost me everything that mattered. In the strange arithmetic of fate, that seemed like an excellent return on investment. As I finished my wine and prepared to go inside, I made a mental note to write a thank you card to that little piece of sterling silver. It was the best investment I'd ever made, even though I hadn't known I was making it at the time. Sometimes the smallest moments create the biggest changes. Sometimes what looks like an ending is actually a beginning. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, a dropped fork can save your entire life.